Chapter 12, Social Psychology. Basic questions we're going to be addressing in Lecture 1. What is social psychology? What is Levine's interactionist perspective? How do we explain others and our own behavior? So in the last chapter on personality, we discussed this equation. Again, it's mathematical looking, but it's not mathematical. And I said that if you forget everything that you've learned in this class, remember this, that behavior is complex. Behavior reflects a complex interaction between disposition and situation. So let's parse this equation one more time. So disposition are traits and attributes that you possess. The situation is the context in which you operate, so we can explain behavior on the face of it quite simply by saying that all behavior, no matter how simple, ultimately reflects this complex interaction, disposition and situation. So I mentioned last time that disposition is the realm of the personality psychologist, whereas the situation is the realm of the social psychologist. So social psychology, and this is a textbook definition, concerns how the real or imagined presence of others influences how we think, feel, and behave. And I've got imagined presence in there in the definition because we still are influenced by the presence of others even though they're not there. So, for example, if we're home alone and we're having our dinner, we'll probably still eat with a fork and a knife and a spoon, and we won't dig in with our hands. I guess this depends on the culture and your background and that sort of thing, but most American people, I guess, your typical American will not eat with their hands, they will eat with silverware. So why do we do that? Well, because we've been socialized to do that. So anyway, social psychology is a vast domain within the broader discipline of psychology. Sample topics include the social self, social perception, social influence, group dynamics, prejudice, aggression, attraction, helping behavior, and more. So I teach social psychology, and I teach it beginning with the social self. And I just wanted to mention very briefly, the social self, for example, reflects that idea that the self, the very sense of self, your self-concept is social in origin. And you've seen a couple of videos in this class, if you've chosen to watch the Watch and Respond videos. One of the videos that you saw on consciousness involved a illustration of the rouge test. That is, you put a little bit of rouge on a child's cheek, and if they look in a mirror and they reach for their own cheek and they notice that the rouge is on their own cheek, then you can say that they have a sense of self, at least an emerging sense of self. So what happens thereafter is that little kids begin to use themselves as a point of reference, and they're using personal pronouns, I and me and that sort of thing. So they have a sense of themselves as being a distinct entity, separate and apart from the world and the people that populate it. And then based on that, they go out into the world and they get feedback from others. And then some of that feedback they internalize, and that becomes part of their self-definition, part of that constellation of beliefs that they have about themselves known as the self-concept. So anyway, social psychology is a vast subdiscipline within the broader discipline of psychology. Lots and lots of research activity going on in social psychology. And again, I wanted to mention that if you find that you're interested in any of these topics, remember that you can take any one of these classes, or you can explore any one of these topics in more depth if you take a course specific in that area. So there's courses that you can take in social psychology that will go more vertically into this material. But for our purposes, this is an introductory course, and I select out of a massive material, which you'll encounter in the chapter, those topics that I want to highlight. And I want to highlight them because they're interesting and I think important for a number of different reasons. So a little brief history. So in 1930s to 50s, social psychology really took off, and the man primarily responsible, surprise, surprise, Adolf Hitler. Why Hitler? Well, when the Allies invaded Nazi Germany and discovered the atrocities that were committed or being committed by the Nazis, it kind of left everybody scratching their heads. How is it that in one of the most civilized, technologically and intellectually advanced nations of the world that people could do this sort of thing to other human beings? How is it that Hitler arranged things so that ordinary, well-meaning people just like you and I would participate in this massive ethnic cleansing, essentially, that resulted in millions and millions of people dying? So everybody was wondering about that, particularly psychologists like Kurt Lewin. Lewin actually fled Germany before Hitler came to power in the 30s, as did a lot of Jews, came to the United States, and he's credited with being the father of modern experimental social psychology because he was one of the first to use experimentation to study social behavior. He came up with this interactionist perspective that we've seen before, in that behavior equals situation or disposition interacting with situation. We've seen that before. Here Lewin makes it look even more mathematical than it actually is. And essentially what you're seeing in this equation is behavior, B, equals or is a function of the person-environment interaction. And again, this reflects that important intersection of personality and social psychology. So social psychologists are fascinated, compelled by, interested in studying the power of the situation, and how, in some cases, the power of the situation can overwhelm disposition and lead us to do things that would surprise even ourselves. So that's what social psychologists are pretty much all about. Certainly, social psychologists acknowledge the importance of personality characteristics and attributes and that which we bring to the situation as interacting with this situation. But the primary focus is understanding how the real or imagined presence of others influences how we think, feel, and behave. So selected topics, we're going to begin with social perception. And you can think of, and I've mentioned this before in this class, but you can think of yourself as an information processing machine. So your senses are processing sensory information from the eyes and the ears and so forth, but we're also processing social information. And you can think of social perception as that branch of social psychology that studies how we perceive others and ultimately how they perceive us. So I'd like you to pause this video, and I've included a link that will lead you, it's a YouTube link that will lead you to a sort of an awful event that occurred, and it made it into the national press, but it was a busload of kids picking on the school bus monitor. So pause this, check out that video, watch it. You don't have to watch the whole thing. It's about 10 minutes in length, but watch it. And as you're watching it, I want you to pay attention to how you're explaining these kids' behavior. That is, these kids that are picking on the bus monitor. What comes to mind for you with respect to an explanation of why these kids are doing what they're doing? So pause this, watch this, and then come on back. So presumably you've watched the video and you had some reaction to it. When I first saw this, it was on the news, and I had never watched the actual video, the full video, until I started incorporating it into lecture. But I've seen the whole video, and I've got to be honest with you, my first explanation is those little, you know what. And boy, if I hope they really got what they deserve for doing that to that poor lady. And I suspect that a lot of people had that same sort of reaction, but this is what we do. As human beings, we're in the business of explaining other people's behavior. We're interested, we're amateur social psychologists, so to speak, in figuring out why people do what they do. And people are interested also in observing us and trying to explain why we do what we do. So the branch of social psychology, or the research program within social psychology that addresses this process of us explaining other people's behavior, is known as attribution or attribution theory. So attribution theory concerns how we explain others' behavior. And we're in the habit of doing this. We do it all the time. So An attribution is an inference we make about the cause of another's behavior. There's a couple of different flavors of attributions. We have internal attributions and external attributions. Think of an internal attribution as us determining that it's something about the person. It's their disposition that caused them to do what they did. So in the case of these little bullies, we might explain their behavior as being a internal trait that's relatively stable, that these kids are mean and evil little guys and they deserve whatever they get in life because they're evil and mean, and they're doing what they're doing because they're evil and mean, cruel, sadistic, what have you. So that would be an internal attribution. An external attribution would mean that it's something about the environment, the situation. So once we've drawn our conclusion about them being little bullies, evil kids, and we've thought about it, and possibly we might change our minds to include the social context of being on the bus. Maybe some of you have had the experience of being on a bus and maybe being on the receiving end of bullying, or maybe you've even dealt it out yourself. And if we consider that context, the school bus, what's going on there? Are they going home from school? And did they have a bad day? And are they going home to an environment where they're being picked on and bullied, and they have a lot of latent hostility that they want to displace onto some other person, and that sort of thing? So we might consider also the situational factors that contributed to the behavior. But our tendency is to make these internal attributions. We'll address that in a minute, that tendency to explain the causes of somebody's behavior as being something about them. So concept check here just to make sure you have these flavors of attributions clear. In the image below, what sort of attribution is the driver of this car making? So here we presume that somebody has been stuck behind somebody driving slow in the fast lane, so they're holding up the sign, "Get out of the fast lane, moron." So maybe you've been in that situation. You're behind somebody, you're trying to get from point A to point B, and there that person is driving slow in the fast lane. Top 10 in my list of things that piss me off. So what do? What an idiot. It's not a difficult concept that the far left lane is the fast lane, the far right is the slow lane. So if you want to drive slow, go over there, get out of the fast lane. You idiot, you moron. So what sort of attribution is this person making? Or what sort of attributions do we make when we draw the conclusion that that person is an idiot? That would be an internal attribution. And I think this is the tendency. Maybe some of you had that experience. And driving slow in the fast lane is just one of those behaviors that we seek to explain, and that we might explain in terms of an internal attribution. But one of the things we're doing is ignoring, overlooking the power of the situation. Maybe there's something going on in that person's situation that we haven't considered. And that gets us to the fundamental attribution bias. So the fundamental attribution bias is sometimes referred to as the error, the fundamental attribution error, the FAE for short. This is when we attribute another's behavior to internal causes while overlooking possible or even probable external causes. So, for example, if I explain somebody's driving slow in the fast lane behavior as being internal, then what am I doing is I'm overlooking those possible situational factors that may be underpinning that person's behavior, or even probable external causes. That is, maybe the weather's bad and the right lane is full of slush, and so now they're driving in the fast lane slowly. So the fundamental attribution is when we explain erroneously, possibly erroneously, somebody's behavior in terms of internal as opposed to external causes. And this is what we tend to do. It's a tendency. We don't do it all the time, but our tendency is to make those internal attributions while systematically overlooking possible external or situational explanations. One of the early studies that identified the presence of this fundamental attribution error was a kind of a clever study. The idea was to set up a compelling experience for research participants, and that experience was participating in a game show like Jeopardy, for example. Alex Trebek, maybe some of you have watched Jeopardy. So Alex Trebek is the game show host, and then the contestants come on and they answer the questions posed by the host, and the host's role is to tell them whether they got the answer right or wrong. So the study kind of went like this. Let's look at this image. In the green are the questioners, that is the Alex Trebek character, and then the purple here are the contestants. So what the study did was randomly assign individuals to 3 different roles, and the research participants were aware that they were being randomly assigned to one role or the other. So the roles were that of questioner, that is the Alex Trebek character, the role of the contestant, that is the person who is tasked with answering the questions, and then you had the observers. These are the people in the audience. So individuals were randomly assigned to one or the other of those conditions. If they were randomly assigned to the questioner condition, they were asked to develop a series of questions based on an area of their own expertise. The role of the contestant was to answer the questions, and they could either get it right or wrong, and then the observer's role was to watch the proceedings of the quiz show. And then individuals were asked to rate the questioner and the contestant with respect to their intelligence. That is, how does it compare to the intelligence of an average student, an average college student? And so the results were that, and let's look at this over here on the left, that the contestants rated themselves as being less intelligent than the average student. They rated the questioner as being more intelligent than the average student. Let's look over here. The observers, these are the people in the audience. What did they do? Well, we see the same pattern of results. We see them as rating the contestant as being less intelligent than the average student. We see them rating the questioner as being more intelligent or more not knowledgeable than the average student. So what this suggests is that even though the participants understood that they had been randomly assigned to their role, they systematically rated the contestant, who was getting the answers wrong, right, as being less intelligent and the questioner as being more. So they essentially forgot the fact that this was a complete setup. They attributed the higher intelligence to the questioner because the questioner was the one that knew all the answers, as with telling the contestant that they got it wrong or right. And this is a mistake. So this amounts to, and this is my analogy, this amounts to us watching a movie and actually believing that the role an actor is playing has something to do with their actual personality, that they are like the role that they're playing. And so what are we doing here? We're making an internal attribution. In this case, we're explaining the contestants' inability to answer the questions, at least in part in terms of their intelligence. And this is making an internal attribution. We're forgetting the fact that it was a setup, that they were randomly assigned, and that the questioners made up all the questions and the answers based on an area of their own expertise. So the fundamental attribution bias is a pernicious bias, a pernicious tendency that leads us to, in some cases, erroneously explain somebody's behavior as being dispositional at the trait level and fundamentally overlooking and ignoring the power of the situation. That might be a perfectly adequate explanation of their behavior. So the question becomes, why do we make the fundamental attribution error? So here's some explanations, possible explanations. And this one comes from sensation and perception. So figure and ground. As perceivers, we separate figure from ground. Take a look at this image, and I believe we used this image in chapter 4 when we were talking about sensation or perception. But this is an example of one of those ambiguous images. It can either be a vase, that is, if the black is seen as the background, what stands out is the white. So the white enters the foreground, and what we see is a shape here. It looks like a vase. However, if we perceive the white as being the background, what stands out, what becomes salient is the shape of the black here. So we see faces looking at each other. So this is one of those ambiguous images. What it is depends on what's in the foreground and what's in the background. So in most situations that we're observing, the person is salient. That is, they are in the foreground. So we're looking at that person, and we have limited knowledge of their situational factors. And you can think of the situational factors as being that which is in the background. We have no knowledge often of other people's situations. What we pay attention to is them. They're the ones that are salient. They stand out. And in part, this underpins our tendency to explain their behavior in terms of something as being something about them. Then there's the just world hypothesis. And this is the belief that people deserve what they get and get what they deserve. So good people are entitled automatically to good stuff, whereas bad people are experiencing misfortune and so forth because they are bad. The problem with this is that it can lead us to blame the victim. That is, if something bad happens to an individual and we believe that bad people get what they deserve, bad things happen to bad people, then we're making the fundamental attribution error. And in many cases, this can be incorrect. It's incorrect to conclude, for example, that a homeless person is in their situation because of some weakness of character and so forth. It could be that they've just fallen on hard times, no fault of their own. In cases of sexual assault and rape, a lot of women will hesitate to come forward and seek justice because they know that if it goes to trial, that the defense attorney is going to try to dismantle their character in public. And that's something awful that somebody has to go to, particularly when they've been victimized. So the defense, and they're just doing their jobs, the defense attorneys, but one of the ways that they develop a strategy is by trying to blame the individual. Why were you out at 2:30 in the morning dressed in that miniskirt and so forth? Weren't you being a little provocative? So as if the victim of rape brought it on themselves. So just world hypothesis. Then again, we have this idea that we're cognitive misers, that we don't like to think a whole lot. And just like we endeavor to preserve physical energy, which is adaptive, we also try to preserve our cognitive energy. That is, we go for the simplest explanation possible. So a research example for this is that immediately after hearing someone argue in a assigned position, people assume that that's how the person really felt. So an assigned position, another clever study, and I'm not going to go into it in the interest of time, but another clever study had individuals assigned to argue a particular position, and everybody knew that they'd been assigned to argue that position. But even though they understood that the person was assigned the position that they were arguing for, people thereafter believed that that's how the person really felt, which is absurd, because if you're assigned to argue a position, let's say you're a Republican, but you're assigned to argue a more democratic an issue from a more Democrat perspective, then it would be a mistake to assume that the person is a liberal, right, or a Democrat, just because they've been assigned to argue that position. However, a week later, people are much more ready to credit the situational constraints. So what this suggests is that perspectives can change with time. That is, our immediate reaction is to make the fundamental attribution error. In this case, we'll go back to the bullying example. We might possibly erroneously conclude that those little boys are evil, something about them dispositionally, while we overlook the possible environmental or the situational factors that might underpin their behavior. But then if we give ourselves a little time to step back and think about it, we might think, well, maybe something's going on for those kids, and we consider those situational factors. But the tendency for us is to make those initial internal attributions. Some associated facts: self-serving bias and the actor-observer effect, sometimes known as a bias. So these are effects that are associated with the fundamental attribution bias. So we're going to look at the self-serving bias first. So the self-serving bias, I asked you to consider, how do we explain our successes? So I get an A on a test, A plus. How do I explain that? Well, I might say, well, I am brighter than average and more motivated than most students. Thus, I got the A plus. However, if I get an F, I might say that the test was unfair, or the professor didn't teach me well enough, they were unclear in their expectations, and so forth. So what's going on here? When we succeed, we make dispositional attributions. It was something about us. Of course we make these sort of attributions. It's something about my intelligence level that supports me doing very well. And I make this attribution because I experience a boost in my self-esteem by feeling more positively about myself and my performance. Something about me. However, when I fail, I try to distance myself from that. Certainly, I won't explain it in terms of my lack of intelligence or motivation. And I'm more likely to say it's something about the situation. This is what we do. And we do it because we're fundamentally motivated. There's a basic motivation to preserve our self-esteem, to see ourselves in a positive light. And this is a self-serving bias. And there's all kinds of strategies that we employ to maintain a positive image of ourselves. So that's a self-serving bias. The actor-observer effect, often referred to as a bias. What does this have to do with? Well, we know from the fundamental attribution that we tend to explain others' behavior as being due to internal or dispositional causes. However, we tend to explain our own behavior as being due to situational causes. Example of this. So, back to the person driving slow in the fast lane. So another person driving slow in the fast lane is an idiot. We make that conclusion. But when I drive in the slow in the fast lane, I do it because I want to go over the speed limit, but not that much over it. So if you're a commuter, you know what I'm talking about. If I'm commuting, there's always those people that are going 90 miles an hour in the fast lane, but I don't want to go that fast. I want to go 75. As long as I'm going 10 miles over the speed limit, I'm okay. So I don't want to be in the middle or the far right because I'm going to have to be changing lanes constantly as I encounter those conscientious citizens driving the speed limit. So I don't want to be weaving all over the road, so I go 75 in the fast lane. But sure enough, I look in my rearview mirror and there's this other person going 90 in the BMW. Do I move over? No, because I don't want to be weaving. Let him go around me if he wants to go so fast. 10 miles an hour over the speed limit is plenty. So this is what we do. We tend to explain other people's behavior as being dispositional, but we tend to explain, or at least we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the situation. That's the actor-observer effect. So why do we do this? Because actors have more knowledge of their own situation than observers. So again, we go back to that example from sensation and perception. What stands out in any situation? If we're the observer, it's the person that we're observing. And their situation fades into the background. We know nothing about them. So we make an internal or dispositional attribution. What else can we do? Right? But when we're the actors, right? When we are the actors, we have intimate knowledge of our own situation. We know what our particular environmental situation is, what's going on for us, and so forth. So we're much more likely to take the situation into account when explaining our own behavior. So I want to finish with this little funny down here. This is Peanuts. So Linus says, "Why are you always so anxious to criticize me?" And then Lucy says, "I just think I have a knack for seeing other people's faults." And then Linus says, "What about your own faults?" Lucy says, "I have a knack for overlooking them." That is the actor-observer bias in action. So learning objectives. Define social psychology. Explain Levine's interactionist perspective. Describe the fundamental attribution error, its causes, associated effects, such as the self-serving bias and the actor-observer effect, and the implications of the fundamental attribution error and the associated effects. And we have a couple of red font objectives: describe group polarization and describe groupthink and explain how it develops. You'll have to go into the text and read about those. You can expect quiz questions as well as examination questions on red font objectives, as well as the other objectives.